Hello, Chris Green here with the Flood Insurance Guru. If you've got questions about flood insurance, flood education, flood zone changes, elevation certificates, click below to visit our website, floodinsuranceguru.com. You can also check out our daily flood education videos on our YouTube channel. Remember, we have an educational background on flood mitigation, which means we can help you understand flood risks like this right here, your flood insurance, and mitigating your property long term to help you minimize flood losses and flood premiums. Today we're talking about what is the difference between a flood hazard boundary map and a flood insurance rate map. Today we're talking about what is the flood hazard boundary map. The flood hazard boundary map is a map that is helped designed by the National Flood Insurance Program and FEMA that helps determine certain boundaries along the mud flow area of the boundary map and certain hazards that fall within that special flood hazard area. Today we're talking about what are flood insurance rate maps. These are the actual official maps of FEMA that puts out communities that identifies the floodplains, these hazards, with the base flood elevation. Today we're talking about base flood elevation, also known as BFE. The entire world of flood insurance revolves around base flood elevation. That's how all the rates are determined. So what is base flood elevation? Well, we're standing at the base flood elevation right now. And what this means is this is the level that the National Flood Insurance Program or FEMA thinks that flooding could come to on maybe a normal basis. And if it exceeds that level, it's going to be pretty rare. The probability is going to be within that 2%. Also known as the 100-year flood zone, or maybe even a 500-year flood zone. These two levels, so certain things have to happen, certain things have to happen to get above that level. Flooding could possibly come to. It sets the different zones.
Today we're talking about what is a flood zone X and how does it impact you? Well, flood zone X is an area of minimal flooding risk that the government has not determined the exact probability of. However, with flood zone X, the flood insurance is not going to be mandatory and they're not going to be in special flood zone hazard areas, which means they're required. However, almost up to 30% of flooding right at this moment occurs in flood zone X. Take Houston, for example. Most of Houston was in a flood zone X. And the reason why it's not mandatory is you can't really determine the risk. If you have a hurricane coming inland, it drops 40 inches of rain, everything's in a high-risk flood zone at that point. And so that's one of the reasons why flood zone X is considered minimal risk.
So what is flood zone A? Today we're here on the river and we're in a special flood hazard area. And what we're talking about today is what is flood zone A? It's a question we get every day, and it's one of the main flood zones across the country. So what exactly is flood zone A? Remember, flood zone A is within that special flood hazard area, that 1% annual chance. This means within any given circumstance, there's a 1% chance that it could flood within a given year. Now, one of the big things to know about flood zone A is the majority of the time, a flood insurance study report has not been fully done, so many times there's not a base flood elevation. And so that's important to understand. That's kind of what separates an A from things like an AE or AO flood zone, is not having a base flood elevation. So then what is flood zone AE?
Today we're talking about what is a flood zone AE. Well, flood zone AE is a special hazard flood zone area. And what this means is that flood insurance is going to be required in this area if you have a mortgage or anything like that. Now, if you own the property out clear, flood insurance is never going to be required. But what a flood zone AE is what's called a 100-year flood zone. And what that means is 1 in every 100 chances the probability of it flooding. So strictly a probability is how this is determined. It could have been that this property has flooded in back-to-back years, but it doesn't change the probability because they look at the bigger picture here. So this is what a flood zone AE is.
Today, we're here on the beach and we're talking about coastal flood zones. We're particularly talking about V zones. These are coastal high hazard areas. These are areas that are susceptible to wave flooding, high tide flooding during a hurricane and things like that. These are still part of the 100-year flood zone. Flood zone V, flood insurance is still going to be required. So that's a brief description of what flood zone V is. Zones and the different panels. So these are all the different moving parts of a flood insurance rate map. As you can see, with flood hazard boundary maps and flood insurance rate maps, they each identify some different things, but they both play a major important role in understanding flood insurance and flood threats and different risk when it comes to mud flows and some other things.